Next, there are several reasons to see that Acts was written around 62 AD. The book ends with Paul still alive. No mention is made of the death of either Paul or Peter or James or Nero's persecution of the Christians in Rome in 64. Luke had included many other persecution accounts in Acts and the death of the apostle James and the deacon Stephen. So putting all these things together, it seems that Luke has published Acts around 62. And Luke's gospel was written before Acts, and since Luke likely used copies of Matthew and Mark, all three of those gospels must have been written before 62, the date of Acts. Now, it's quite plausible to me that Peter may have traveled to Rome in the 40s. He was reported by Irenaeus and others to have started the church in Rome, and that was around 42 when he had fled from Herod Agrippa. The New Testament simply says in Acts 12:17 that Peter left from Mark's family's house to another place without specifying where. 1 Corinthians 1 implies that Peter had visited Corinth sometime in the 40s, and Corinth was on the way to Rome, more than halfway there actually. And it's quite plausible that Mark went with Peter as his interpreter and assistant as Peter left from Mark's family's house, and then started taking notes on his preaching during the years that he was in Rome. And when Peter returned back to Jerusalem about 4 years later, Mark gave away copies of his notes to the Roman Christians, and maybe kept revising his document in the years afterward. Especially, Peter came back to Rome in the mid-60s and was later martyred by Nero. So Mark was taking more notes from Peter's preaching, perhaps revising during the 60s. And his final revised version would have been distributed after Peter's death around 67. The Gospel of Matthew must have been written around 55 to allow time for Luke to hear about it and get a copy and use it in writing in his Gospel. And again, this would be kind of the final version of Matthew, or let's say a later version, if there was an earlier version. Matthew could have kept revising it after Luke got a copy. But there was probably a copy that came from Matthew's area to Luke around 55 or up to 60, let's say, but probably earlier. If Matthew wrote it originally in Hebrew or Aramaic, collecting together the apostles' teaching for their weekly ministry in the early Jerusalem church, it could have been written quite a bit earlier, such as the 30s or 40s, but it's also possible that the apostles' teaching was only in oral form for the first decade or two. Either way, in my view, Matthew was definitely written down within about 20 years, during which time many eyewitnesses were still alive, so people could check the written version with what the eyewitnesses were saying and make sure they matched. By the way, there is a difference of opinion among scholars as to whether Jesus was crucified in 30 AD or 33 AD, leading to some question about the subsequent chronology of the early church. You can research this further in these supplementary links. The Gospel of John was written after the Synoptic Gospels, after John had moved to Ephesus. Church historian Eusebius wrote that John wrote his Gospel because he noticed the other three Gospels were missing some information about Jesus' life in the early part of his ministry. And you can check this out in the supplement. I would date the Gospel of John to sometime between 65 and 85, but you'll hear different dates on that. So in summary on the dating, Jesus' disciples started teaching and preaching about Jesus immediately, within less than 2 months after his resurrection. They worked together to standardize his teachings, with the 12 apostles leading the teaching ministry, since they knew Jesus and his teachings the best. For the first decade, the teaching was primarily passed along through oral presentation rather than written documents, as the disciples expected Jesus to return at any moment. Matthew may have written down an early version of his gospel during this early period of 10 to 20 years, since church historians from the 2nd and 3rd century said that he wrote the first gospel. Then, as persecution increased and the apostle James was martyred, and the remaining 11 apostles were scattered out of Jerusalem in the mid-40s, and everyone realized they needed to write down the apostles' teachings. My estimate is that Mark was originally written around 10 years after Jesus, based on Peter's preaching in Rome. Matthew's first version was certainly within 20 years, quite possibly within 10 years after Jesus, and Matthew's final revised version within 30 years. And Luke's version was within 30 years. John was written later, 40 to 50 years after Jesus. There was likely some use of the earlier Gospels by the later Gospel writers such as Luke and maybe John. All 4 Gospels were written while eyewitnesses were still alive, and all 4 were based on eyewitness testimony and were approved by apostles who had seen and known Jesus. Here I've put the dates that I've suggested into this diagram of the modified 3-source hypothesis. You could pause and look at this if you want. And then here's a summary of what we've talked about. Who wrote the Gospels? They were not anonymous. And the gospel is written. I've given some suggested dates based on the evidence. And yes, probably some of them were using some of them as a source, especially Luke. They're written while eyewitnesses were still alive, based on eyewitness testimony. And the next key question is the time gap. Was the time gap between Jesus and the writing of these apostles' documents too long for accurate memory?